October 14, 1985. Congressman Steve SOLARZ stood on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives, holding a document that would end a 20-year alliance. In his hands were bank records showing that Ferdinand Marcos had stolen over $356 million from U.S. foreign aid meant to help the poorest Filipinos. For 2 decades, America had supported Marcos as a crucial Cold War ally. The Pentagon needed his military bases. The State Department valued his anti-communist stance. Presidents Nixon, Ford, Carter, and Reagan had all called him a friend of democracy. But Steve SOLARZ, a 43-year-old congressman from Brooklyn, was about to prove that America's closest Asian ally was actually its biggest fraud. And once he finished speaking that day, Ferdinand Marcos would never receive another dollar of U.S. support. To understand how devastating this was for Marcos, you need to understand how completely dependent he was on American backing. Since 1965, the United States had provided the Philippines with over $2.5 billion in military and economic aid. American weapons kept his army loyal. American money kept his economy afloat. American diplomatic support kept international critics quiet. Most importantly, American backing gave Marcos legitimacy. When human rights groups accused him of torture and murder, he could point to continued U.S. support as proof that he was defending democracy. When opponents called him a dictator, he could remind them that America's presidents treated him as a democratic leader. Without American support, Ferdinand Marcos was just another third-world strongman with a collapsing economy and an angry population. With it, he was an indispensable Cold War ally, whose excesses had to be tolerated for the greater good. Steve SOLARZ was about to take that shield away from him. But SOLARZ wasn't supposed to be Marcos's enemy. As chairman of the House Subcommittee on Asian and Pacific Affairs, SOLARZ was expected to support America's Asian allies, not destroy them. He was a liberal Democrat, but he was also a pragmatist, who understood the importance of strategic partnerships in fighting communism. For years, SOLARZ had given Marcos the benefit of the doubt. Yes, there were troubling reports about human rights abuses. Yes, the Philippine economy was struggling despite massive U.S. aid. Yes, opposition leaders were complaining electoral fraud and corruption, but the Cold War required difficult choices. And if supporting Marcos meant keeping Soviet influence out of Southeast Asia, then supporting Marcos was the right choice. That changed on August 21, 1983, when Ninoy Aquino was assassinated at Manila International Airport. SOLARZ watched the news coverage from Washington with growing horror, not just because a prominent opposition leader had been murdered, but because of how obviously the Marcos government was lying about what happened. The story about a lone gunman, the immediate killing of the alleged assassin, the refusal to allow independent investigation. It was all too convenient, too neat, too clearly orchestrated. For the first time, Steve SOLARZ began to suspect that America might be supporting not just an authoritarian ally but a criminal regime. But suspicion wasn't enough. SOLARZ was a lawyer by training and a politician by profession. He needed evidence, and gathering evidence about Ferdinand Marcos's crimes would require using the full investigative power of the U.S. Congress. Over the next 2 years, SOLARZ launched the most comprehensive congressional investigation into an allied leader in American history. He subpoenaed State Department cables. He demanded CIA intelligence reports. He interviewed refugees, dissidents, and former Marcos officials who had fled to America. Most importantly, he did something no one had ever done before. He followed the money. Working with congressional investigators and forensic accountants, SOLARZ traced the flow of U.S. aid money from American banks to Swiss accounts, controlled by Marcos and his associates. What he found was the largest systematic theft of foreign aid in American history. Yes, military aid meant to buy weapons for the Philippine Army had been diverted to purchase luxury items for Marcos's family. Economic development funds meant to build roads and schools had been invested in New York real estate owned by Marcos' cronies. Emergency disaster relief had been used to buy art collections and jewelry. Most shocking of all, SOLARZ discovered that Marcos was stealing money faster than America could give it to him. Every dollar of aid was being matched by $2 of theft from the Philippine Treasury. The United States wasn't just supporting a dictator. It was funding its own robbery. But SOLARZ knew that exposing financial crimes alone wouldn't be enough to change U.S. policy. American officials might be willing to overlook corruption if they believed Marcos was strategically important. SOLARZ needed to prove that supporting Marcos was actually damaging American interests. That's when he made his most devastating discovery. In early 1985, SOLARZ obtained classified intelligence reports showing that Marcos's human rights abuses were driving Filipinos toward communist insurgency. The more brutal Marcos became, the more popular the Communist New People's Army became. The dictator America was supporting to fight communism was actually creating more communists. It was the perfect argument for ending U.S. support. Marcos wasn't just morally wrong, he was strategically counterproductive. By October 1985, SOLARZ had compiled enough evidence to destroy Ferdinand Marcos's relationship with the United States. But he still needed the perfect moment to present it. He needed a stage big enough and dramatic enough to force the Reagan administration to act. That moment came when Marcos announced he would hold snap elections in February 1986 to prove his democratic legitimacy. SOLARZ immediately announced that he would lead a congressional delegation to observe the Philippine elections. It was a brilliant move. If the elections were fair, Marcos would be vindicated and SOLARZ would look foolish. But if they were rigged, SOLARZ would have front-row seats to witness electoral or fraud by an American ally. Ferdinand Marcos tried desperately to keep SOLARZ away from the Philippines. He had the Philippine embassy in Washington lobby against the congressional visit. He had his American supporters argue that congressional observers would interfere with Philippine sovereignty. But SOLARZ had something Marcos couldn't overcome: congressional authority and media attention. On February 5, 1986, 2 days before the Philippine elections, Steve SOLARZ arrived in Manila with a delegation of 12 congressmen and dozens of international journalists. For the next 4 days, they would witness the most blatant electoral fraud in modern democratic history. Ballot boxes stuffed with pre-marked votes. Opposition poll watchers intimidated by armed thugs. Vote-counting computers that mysteriously broke down when they showed Ninoy Aquino winning. Military escorts that prevented observers from reaching certain polling stations. But the most damaging moment came on February 9th, when the official election commission's own computer operators walked off their jobs in protest, declaring on live television that they were being ordered to falsify results in favor of Marcos. Steve SOLARZ was there, cameras rolling, as Marcos's own election workers called him a fraud. Within hours, SOLARZ was on international television describing what he had witnessed. "This was not an election," he said. "This was a theft of democracy broadcast live to the world." But SOLARZ didn't stop with media interviews. On February 11th, 4 days after the fraudulent election, he did something that changed everything. He called for an emergency session of Congress to cut off all aid to the Philippines. Standing on the House floor with photographs and documents from Manila, SOLARZ delivered the most devastating speech of his political career.
"Mr. Speaker, we have just witnessed an American ally steal an election in front of American observers. Ferdinand Marcos has made a mockery of democracy while stealing American taxpayer money. The question before this Congress is simple. Will we continue to fund fraud and tyranny, or will we finally stand up for the values we claim to represent?"
The speech was broadcast live on C-SPAN and replayed on evening news programs around the world. Within 24 hours, congressional offices were flooded with calls demanding an end to support for Marcos. But the real impact came in the Philippines, where SOLARZ's speech was broadcast by rebel radio stations to millions of Filipinos. For the first time, they heard an American official calling their president a fraud and a thief. It destroyed the last pillar of Marcos's legitimacy: American support. 11 days later, on February 22nd, the People Power Revolution began, and when Marcos called the White House asking for American military support to crush the rebellion, he was told that Congress had made continued backing impossible. Steve SOLARZ had done what no Filipino opposition leader had been able to do. He had turned Ferdinand Marcos from an American ally into an American liability. On February 25, 1986, as Marcos fled the Philippines in American helicopters, he was still trying to understand how he had lost American support. For 20 years, he had cultivated relationships with American presidents, military leaders, and business executives. He had positioned himself as indispensable to American strategic interests. But he had never expected to be brought down by a congressman from Brooklyn who cared more about evidence than politics. The contest between Ferdinand Marcos and Steve SOLARZ wasn't really a contest between two men. It was a contest between two ideas about American foreign policy. Marcos represented the Cold War approach: support anyone who opposes communism, regardless of their crimes against their own people. SOLARZ represented a different approach. American support should be based on American values, not just American interests. In the end, SOLARZ proved that even the most strategic relationships become liabilities when they contradict American principles. That supporting dictators in the name of fighting communism often creates more communists. That American aid money should serve American purposes, not enrich American allies. Ferdinand Marcos spent his last years in exile claiming that he had been the victim of a communist conspiracy orchestrated by liberal Democrats in Congress. He never understood that Steve SOLARZ hadn't destroyed him out of ideological opposition, but out of simple outrage at being lied to and robbed. Steve SOLARZ continued serving in Congress until 1993, becoming one of the most respected voices on foreign policy. But his most important contribution to American diplomacy wasn't any bill he passed or treaty he supported. It was proving that congressional oversight could force even presidents to abandon allies who had become criminals. Today, the SOLARZ amendment requires the State Department to certify that foreign aid recipients are not engaged in systematic human rights abuses or large-scale corruption. It's named after the congressman who proved that American values and American interests are not contradictory but complementary. The lesson of the Marcos-SOLARZ confrontation isn't just about one dictator's downfall. It's about the importance of congressional oversight in preventing American foreign policy from becoming complicit in crime. About the power of individual legislators to challenge even the most established diplomatic relationships. About the difference between supporting allies and enabling criminals. October 14, 1985. One speech, 20 years of support ended. A dictator's shield removed. All because one congressman decided that America's reputation was more important than America's convenience. Ferdinand Marcos thought he was untouchable because he had American support. Steve SOLARZ proved that American support comes with American conditions, and when those conditions are violated, even the closest allies become former allies. The Brooklyn congressman who brought down a Pacific dictator. The man who proved that in America, even presidents can be overruled by Congress when democracy is at stake.